Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great show with Sean on boxing. So, I see that John is going in on Ring IQ for a video he made. I don't know. I haven't seen Ring IQ's video, not yet. I'll check that out later. But basically, trying to give Canelo credit for the Golovkin win, even though you don't need to even use Golovkin when giving Canelo credit, because Canelo's resume is just way better than Bud Crawford. Like, this is not even a conversation. Anyone trying to make it a conversation basically exposes their ignorance and fanboyism. Like, you can like Crawford and you can think Crawford's going to beat Canelo, that's fine. But you can't say that Crawford's resume is nearly as good as Canelo, because it ain't fucking close. But in this comparison, this guy wanted to use specifically Errol Spence, who got knocked the fuck out by Bud Crawford, and Gennady Golovkin, who fought Canelo Alvarez 3 times. One was a draw, which everybody felt that Golovkin deserved to win and got robbed in the cards. And then the next fight was a loss, but a lot of people felt that was a draw. And then the last fight, of course, was a loss. So really, their fights between the three fights should have been one win, one draw, one loss, right? If things would have been fair. But of course they weren't, but that's boxing. You move on with it. But then, of course, this guy wants to specifically focus on these two fighters because he's made a career out of specifically hating on Golovkin. So it's ironic that now he's criticizing Ring IQ for making a career out of hating on PBC and Errol Spence fans. Because literally you're criticizing somebody for doing the exact same thing you historically have done. You've never given Golovkin credit. You lie about how many people he's beaten that were champions. Blatantly lie about it consistently. And act as if people are too stupid to fucking do their own research. He did not only fight 2 world champions, but that's fine. You want to lie because that's the only way you can sort of dismiss people. But let's just take a quick overview. So he thinks that Spence overall is a better fighter than Golovkin, right? So let's look at their early record. So as amateurs, Golovkin won a World Games medal. Then, of course, in the Olympics, he ended up winning a silver medal. Errol Spence was in the Olympics, didn't win a medal. So when you look at their amateur pedigree, right there, Golovkin's pedigree, better than Errol Spence. It's a silver medalist versus a guy who never medaled in the Olympics. He was a player in the Olympics, but unfortunately, he wasn't good enough to actually get a medal. Then as a pro, right, he wants to highlight the fact that Errol Spence was a 3-belt unified champion at welterweight. Well, the irony is that Golovkin was the 3-belt unified champion at middleweight. And then, after getting beat to Canelo Alvarez, came back to win unified titles again at middleweight for a second time. Only 2 belts. It would have been great to see him fight potentially for 3 or 4, but unfortunately he retired and just didn't try to chase any of those other belts afterwards. But so this is a guy who's a 2-time middleweight champion, right? And was unified both times. So Spence gets credit because he was unified once. Golovkin gets no credit for being unified twice. Spence gets tons of praise for beating 7 champions or former champions. Golovkin gets 0 credit for beating 5 past current world champions, and obviously having a draw the first fight with Canelo, which would be 6, because a draw is not a loss. And then, so there you are, right? So 7-6, like, that's the big hype. The fact that Errol Spence has 1 champion more on his resume than Golovkin. The irony in this situation is Errol Spence spent his whole career as a welterweight champion ducking Bud Crawford. Gennady Golovkin spent his whole career as a middleweight being ducked by all the champions, whether it was Felix Sturm, whether it was Peter Quillen, whether it was Billy Joe Saunders, whether it was fucking Cotto, whether it was Sergio Martinez, whether it was literally Canelo Alvarez, who was stripped of his WBC title, which Golovkin got. So he didn't beat a champion to get the WBC title because literally Canelo Alvarez ducked him, right? Could you imagine if that was a black American fighter that a guy ducked blatantly like that and got his title, how this same individual would ridicule the guy. But of course, in this situation, people don't even talk about it. They ignore it and then criticize Golovkin because he didn't beat a champion for the belt. It's not his fault that he was mandated to fight Canelo. Canelo ducked the fight, thus being stripped by the WBC, and then Golovkin obviously ended up getting the belt, right? So many world champions blatantly ducked him, including Chris Eubank, who ducked him as well, right? He was only a regular champion, but nonetheless was a top middleweight during his era. And so you think about potentially all the champions that would have been on Golovkin's resume if they wouldn't have blatantly ducked him. You can't say that about Spence because literally nobody ducked him because the PBC controlled that division outside of the WBO title, which Terence Crawford had, which for 5 years, Errol Spence and the PBC blatantly ducked him to fight meaningless fights against guys who weren't world titles champions to not unify, right? So Errol Spence tried to become undisputed. He lost. Golovkin could have fought Billy Joe Saunders for undisputed, but chose to fight Canelo Alvarez a second time, coming off of the draw. I mean, it's hard to criticize a guy for fighting a pound-for-pound top fighter and a pay-per-view superstar in boxing, right? Because you're obviously going to make way more money fighting him than you would facing Billy Joe Saunders for a WBO title. So both were in position to become undisputed. Neither of them successfully became undisputed. So the irony is this too. When you think about great accolades that Golovkin was a part of, he had the highest KO ratio out of any middleweight world champion, right? People love to talk about that with regards to Wilder, but with regards to Golovkin, we ignore that because we don't want to give Golovkin any praise at all. Golovkin also had the highest and consistently one of the top 3 highest percentages of jabs landed and thrown in fights. So always his jab was one of the most successful jabs in boxing, unlike Spence, who was never on the top 10 list for jabs landed or jabs thrown. But Golovkin was consistently. Even when he was old and not at his best anymore, he was still able to be very successful thanks to his boxing skills, primarily his great jab. But then you want to highlight Spence's jab as if Spence had a better jab than Golovkin. I don't know when that was ever a realistic scenario. But okay, you can push that, but I don't think any real boxing people are going to agree with you. And then we think about Golovkin's title defenses. And of course, people discredit a lot of those titles because they were for the WBA regular title, because Felix Sturm and the WBA consistently ducked the fight with Golovkin. So unfortunately, he wasn't able to get that WBA title much later in his career, even though he'd been the WBA regular champion fucking for years, right? And chased obviously the Felix Sturm fight, and obviously was denied time and time again in the WBA, being politically as they were, didn't give him the opportunity. But he ended up breaking Bernard Hopkins' record for most middleweight title defenses ever. If you go and look right now at the fighters' all-time highest title defenses, you'll see that Golovkin's name is up there with Joe Calzaghe, what's his face, Michael Zuski, Joe Louis, Klitschko, Golovkin's is right up there, as well as Omar Navarez as well, right? It's ironic because no one wants to give Inouye credit, but literally he beat a guy that had 27 successful title defenses. 27. But you look at all those accolades, and then you look at what Errol Spence did. In comparison, nothing. Not the highest KO percentage for a welterweight ever, not the most successful title defenses ever, not the best jab in boxing during his period of time as a professional boxer. No, none of those accolades. Didn't win a medal in the Olympics, didn't become a champion again after getting beat. We're still waiting to see if he comes back. I mean, of course, people that are cheerleaders and fans of Spence, they like to pretend that he will come back and he will become a champion. Maybe he will. It'll be interesting to see if he can do that. But he'll also have to become unified, which is what Golovkin did.